The palace of the Alcazar of Madrid was plunged into an unsettling silence as the clock struck midnight. The hallways, normally bustling with the coming and going of courtiers, were now deserted under the dim light of the candles, which cast ghostly shadows over the valuable tapestries that adorned the walls. In her private chambers, the young Princess Maria Antonia of Austria observed her reflection in the silver mirror that her father, Emperor Leopold I, had given her before sending her to Spain to become the wife of her cousin, Charles II, the King of Spain. At her 16 years, Maria Antonia felt the full weight of the Habsburg dynasty on her fragile shoulders. She was beautiful, with the characteristic blonde hair that so many Austrian princesses had worn before her. But she also bore on her face the unmistakable features of her lineage, the prominent jaw and the bulging lower lip, physical marks of the inbreeding that had characterized her family for generations. "Is your duty an heir to Spain?" her father had told her before departing from Vienna. "The fate of our house depends on it." Those words echoed in her mind as she prepared for bed. Her marriage to King Charles I had been arranged with a single purpose: to perpetuate the dynasty of the Spanish Austrians, which after almost 2 centuries of consanguineous marriages was on the brink of extinction. However, after 6 months of marriage, the young queen still showed no signs of pregnancy. Charles II, her husband and second-degree cousin, was a sickly man. At his 28 years, the monarch seemed much older, weakened by multiple ailments, the fruit of the accumulation of generations of marriages between close relatives. His prognathic jaw was so pronounced that he could barely chew properly. His body was weak and fragile, and his mind often wandered, unable to concentrate on state affairs. The bewitched, that is what his subjects called him, convinced that some curse had fallen upon him. But Maria Antonia, educated in the imperial court of Vienna, knew that there was no spell at all, only the relentless curse of blood shared again and again. That night, a sharp pain in her jaw woke her from a restless sleep. It was the 3rd time in a week that she suffered this torment. She called her lady-in-waiting, Doña Leonor, who hurried with a cloth soaked in rosewater. "Majesty, the pain again?" asked the woman worriedly. Maria Antonia nodded, unable to speak while the pain throbbed in her jaw. When she finally could articulate a word, a metallic taste flooded her mouth. "Something is not right, Leonor," she whispered. "I feel as if my teeth want to escape from my mouth." Doña Leonor brought a candle closer to examine her lady better and stifled a cry. At the corner of the queen's lips, where the pain was most intense, something white, hard and pointed was emerging. It looked like a fragment of tooth, but it was out of place, emerging from the flesh itself like a macabre pearl. "Holy heaven!" exclaimed Doña Leonor, crossing herself. "We must call the royal physician immediately." Dr. Marignon, court physician and a man of science respected throughout Europe, arrived at dawn. After examining the young queen, his face darkened. "Majesty, a condition that I have seen only in some members of royal families," he explained cautiously. "I call it demented calcification. It is a strange manifestation where the body produces dental material in inappropriate places. I have studied similar cases in other Habsburgs, although never so severe." "Does it have a cure?" Maria Antonia asked, terrified. The physician shook his head. "The only thing we can do is alleviate your pain and extract the aberrant teeth when they appear." "Extract?" The princess's voice trembled. "Do you mean they will keep appearing?" "I fear so, Majesty. This condition is linked to the particular history of your noble house." Maria Antonia immediately understood what the physician dared not say openly. It was another consequence of inbreeding, another mark of the Habsburg curse. That same afternoon, as the sun set over Madrid, dyeing the sky blood red, the young queen experienced another episode of pain, more intense than the previous one. This time the physician had to intervene, extracting with silver tweezers a small, perfectly formed tooth that had emerged from her right cheekbone. When the tooth was extracted, Maria Antonia felt momentary relief, but also something more. A tear slid down her cheek, but upon touching it with her fingers, she discovered with horror that it was not a normal tear. It was solid, white and shiny. A calcified tear, a tiny tooth that had sprouted from her tear duct. "The princess cries teeth," whispered Dona Leonor, terrified. "It is an omen." Indeed, it was an omen, but not of witchcraft, as the superstitious courtiers believed, but of the biological decay of a dynasty that had married itself for too many generations. That night, as the news spread in whispers through the hallways of the Alcazar, Maria Antonia wrote in her diary, "I have discovered in my flesh the curse of our blood. What we have done to preserve our lineage now destroys us from within." The next morning, the royal confessor visited the young queen. Friar Freylan Diaz, a Dominican and theologian, had been sent by King Charles II himself, worried about the rumors of his wife's strange illness. "Majesty," began the friar, "I have come to offer you spiritual consolation in these difficult times." Maria Antonia looked at him sadly. She had spent a terrible night, and 3 new teeth had been extracted from her cheeks and eyelids. "Do you believe, Father, that this is divine punishment?" she asked. The friar pondered his response as royal confessor. He knew the secrets and sins of the royal family, but he was also an educated man who understood more than he could say openly. "God has given us natural laws, Majesty," he finally replied. "When these laws are ignored repeatedly, nature itself rebels. What your family has done for generations, mixing the same blood again and again, goes against those laws." Maria Antonia nodded, understanding perfectly. It was not witchcraft or supernatural curse, but the consequence of the Habsburg matrimonial policy, which had privileged the concentration of power over the health of their offspring. "And what can I do now, Father?" she asked desperately. "Pray, Majesty, and perhaps consider that the true destiny of your house may not be what everyone expects." The friar's words echoed in Maria Antonia's mind for days as her condition worsened. Every morning she awoke to find new teeth sprouting from her skin, from her tears, even from the tips of her fingers. The pain was constant, and soon it became impossible to hide it from the court. Charles Segui, upon learning of the gravity of the situation, fell into a deep melancholy. His wife, his last hope of begetting an heir, was being consumed by the same curse that had weakened him. In his moments of lucidity, the king understood that this illness was simply another manifestation of the price his family had paid for keeping power concentrated through consanguineous marriages. "It is the end," the king murmured to his prime minister. "The blood of the Austrians has turned against itself." Meanwhile, in the European courts, ambassadors reported to their respective monarchs about the strange illness of the Spanish queen. In Versailles, King Louis XIV, the Sun King, received the news with a mixture of compassion and political calculation. If Charles II died without heirs, as seemed increasingly likely, France would have an opportunity to claim the Spanish throne for the House of Bourbon. In Vienna, Emperor Leopold I, father of Maria Antonia, received the news with deep sorrow. He was a Habsburg, like Charles II, and understood better than anyone the price his family had paid for its matrimonial policy. However, as emperor, he also saw the political implications. The imminent extinction of the Spanish branch of his house would open a succession crisis that could trigger a European war. Back in Madrid, as autumn gave way to winter, Maria Antonia's condition stabilized momentarily. The physicians had found a way to mitigate her pain through herbal poultices and regular extractions of the aberrant teeth. However, the young queen had changed. Her face, once beautiful despite the Habsburg features, was now marked by small scars where the teeth had been extracted. More worrying still was her mental state. Maria Antonia had begun to have visions, possibly induced by the constant pain and the medicines she took to alleviate it. In these visions, she saw the future of Spain without the Habsburgs, a future of war and change. "I see blood and fire," she confessed to her lady-in-waiting one night. "I see France and Austria fighting over the corpse of Spain when Charles and I are gone." Dona Leonor, alarmed by these words that could be considered treacherous, tried to calm her lady. "They are just nightmares, Majesty, caused by your suffering. You will soon recover and give Spain the heir it so needs." But Maria Antonia shook her head. "No, Leonor, there will be no heir. The blood of the Habsburgs is exhausted, and perhaps it is for the best. We have reigned for almost 2 centuries, but each generation has been weaker than the previous one. It is time for a new dynasty to take over." These words, spoken in the privacy of her chambers, were practically political heresy. However, they expressed a truth that many in the court already suspected. The House of Austria in Spain was coming to its end. In December 1689, as Madrid was covered in snow, Maria Antonia suffered a collapse during a ceremony in the royal chapel. Urgently carried to her chambers, the young queen entered a febrile state. The physicians, powerless, observed as small teeth began to sprout not only from her skin, but also from her internal organs, as her symptoms revealed. King Charles II, devastated, ordered religious processions and prayers in all the churches of the kingdom. However, deep down, the monarch knew that neither prayers nor medicine could save his wife from the curse that also ran through his own veins. "It is our blood," the king murmured, contemplating the portrait of his grandfather Philip Eo, who had married his cousin Margaret of Austria. "Our blood shared again and again has turned against us." Spring arrived in Madrid with news that shook the Spanish court. Queen Maria Antonia had died after months of agony. The official cause of her death was a malignant fever, but rumors about the true nature of her illness had already spread throughout Europe. It was said that the young queen had been consumed from within by teeth sprouting from her entrails, a grotesque manifestation of the degeneration of the Habsburg dynasty. Charles II, plunged into despair, ordered that his wife's body be buried in the royal pantheon of the El Escorial monastery, alongside the other members of the House of Austria. However, before the burial, the royal physician, Dr. Marignon, requested permission to perform an autopsy. Something unusual but necessary, he argued, to better understand the strange illness that had affected the queen. What the physician discovered confirmed his worst fears. Maria Antonia's body was literally plagued with dental formations in places where they should never exist. Small teeth had grown in her lungs, liver, and even in her heart. "It is the most extreme manifestation of aberrant calcification that I have ever seen," the doctor wrote in his confidential report to the king. "A perversion of nature that can only be explained by the accumulation of generations of consanguinity." The king, upon reading the report, ordered it to be sealed and stored in the secret archives of the crown. The true cause of the queen's death must remain hidden to preserve the dignity of the House of Austria. However, in the European courts, Maria Antonia's death was interpreted as another sign of the decay of the Spanish Habsburgs. In Versailles, Louis XI intensified his diplomatic preparations to secure the Spanish succession for his grandson, Philip of Anjou. Emperor Leopold I began to promote the succession rights of his own son, Archduke Charles. The war of succession that Maria Antonia had predicted in her febrile visions seemed increasingly inevitable. Meanwhile, Charles II, determined to keep his dynasty alive despite everything, contracted marriage again that same year with Mariana of Neuburg, a German princess chosen specifically because she had no close Habsburg blood. It was a desperate attempt to introduce new blood into the lineage and avoid a repetition of Maria Antonia's tragedy. Nevertheless, the damage was already done. Charles II, product of generations of inbreeding, was sterile. His new marriage, like the previous one, would produce no heirs. In the Spanish court, some began to speak in whispers of the curse of the princess who cried teeth, seeing in Maria Antonia's tragic fate an omen of the end of the dynasty. These rumors mixed with popular superstitions about spells and curses that supposedly affected the king, giving rise to his nickname of the Bewitched. Friar Fray Diaz, who had been Maria Antonia's confessor, now became the king's confessor. Knowing the true horrors that had afflicted the late queen, the Dominican tried to guide Charles II toward acceptance of what seemed inevitable, the end of his dynasty. "Majesty," he told him one day during confession, "perhaps you must consider that God's will is that another house reign in Spain after you. It would not be dishonorable to designate a successor from another dynasty if that avoids a civil war." Charles II, in one of his moments of lucidity, replied, "I have considered it, father, but I fear that my decision, whatever it may be, will unleash a European war. France, Austria, England, all have their claims on my inheritance." The friar nodded, understanding the terrible position of the monarch. "Then, Majesty, your responsibility is to choose the successor you believe will cause the least harm to Spain and its domains. These intimate conversations between the king and his confessor unfolded while in the rest of Europe the great powers prepared for the imminent death of Charles Segui, the last of the Spanish Austrians. In Vienna, Emperor Leopold I, still affected by the death of his daughter Maria Antonia, ordered his physicians and scientists to study in depth the hereditary diseases affecting his family. The objective was to better understand the curse that had led to the extinction of the Spanish branch of his house and to prevent something similar from happening in the Austrian branch. Dr. van Swieten, imperial physician, conducted exhaustive genealogical studies of the Habsburg family, tracing patterns of diseases and deformities across generations. His conclusions were alarming. The policy of consanguineous marriages had created a dangerous concentration of recessive genes that manifested in deformities such as mandibular prognathism, mental deficiencies, and in extreme cases like Maria Antonia's, aberrant conditions like demented calcification. The blood of the Habsburgs is literally poisoned by itself, wrote van Sitten in his confidential report to the emperor. Each generation that marries within the family increases the risk of more extreme manifestations of these conditions. Leopold V, impressed by these conclusions, made a transcendental decision. From that moment on, the matrimonial policy of the Austrian Habsburgs would change radically, seeking alliances with families without close kinship to renew the blood of the dynasty. Back in Spain, Charles II's health continued to deteriorate. At his 30 years, the king seemed like an old man consumed by multiple ailments that physicians could not treat effectively. His prognathic jaw, characteristic trait of his family, made speech and eating increasingly difficult for him. His mind, never completely lucid, suffered increasingly frequent periods of confusion. In one of these moments of confusion, the king believed he saw the ghost of Maria Antonia in his chambers. The apparition, probably the fruit of his disturbed mind, spoke to him of the curse of their blood and the need to accept the end of his dynasty for the good of Spain. "The blood of the Austrians has governed for long enough," the apparition told him. "It is time for another house to take over, one without our curse." This vision, real or imaginary, had a profound impact on Charles Segui. The next day he summoned his Council of State and for the first time openly addressed the question of his succession. "If God does not grant me an heir," said the king with a weak but determined voice, "we must ensure that Spain remains united under a strong monarch. I will not allow my kingdom to be torn apart by the ambitions of foreign powers." These words marked the beginning of complex diplomatic negotiations that would culminate years later with Charles II's will, designating as his heir Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, on the condition that the crowns of France and Spain would never unite. Meanwhile, in the aristocratic salons of Madrid, the legend of the princess who cried teeth began to transform into a poetic metaphor for the decay of the Habsburgs. Court poets wrote verses that, under the veil of allegory, spoke of how the obsession with maintaining the purity of royal blood had led the dynasty to its own destruction. One of these poems, attributed to the Duke of Medinaceli, said, "The blue blood, which blue it wished to remain, so much in itself it wanted to preserve itself, that in the end, with itself upon mixing, against nature it revolted. And thus the princess of noble birth, through her eyes cried teeth, while the dynasty approached the final sunset of its fortune." These verses, which circulated in a semi-clandestine manner, captured the essence of the dynastic drama that Spain was experiencing, the end of a royal house that had ruled for almost 2 centuries, victim of its own matrimonial policy. In the Escorial, where Maria Antonia's remains rested alongside those of other Spanish Habsburgs, it was said that the monks sometimes found small teeth on the floor near her tomb, as if the princess continued to cry teeth even after death. This macabre legend, probably born from popular imagination, reinforced the aura of curse surrounding the late queen and, by extension, the entire dynasty. By 1695, 5 years after Maria Antonia's death, Charles Segui was little more than a shadow on the Spanish throne. Incapable of governing effectively, real power had passed to the hands of his wife, Mariana of Neuburg, and various ministers and favorites who vied for influence over the dying monarch. The succession question dominated Spanish and international politics. France, Austria, England, and the United Provinces maneuvered diplomatically, preparing for the inevitable moment when the last Spanish Habsburg exhaled his last breath. In this climate of tension and uncertainty, a young physician named Francisco de Quevedo y Luna, disciple of Dr. Marañón, requested permission to examine the confidential medical archives related to Maria Antonia's illness. His interest was not merely historical. Quevedo had observed similar symptoms, though less severe, in other members of aristocratic families with histories of consanguineous marriages. After weeks of petitions, he was finally granted limited access to the documents. What he discovered left him astonished. The demented calcification that had affected Maria Antonia was not an isolated case. There were records of similar conditions in other members of European royalty, particularly in families with high degrees of consanguinity. "Nature is sending us a clear message," he wrote in his diary. "There are biological laws that cannot be ignored without consequences, not even by those who make human laws." His investigations led him to formulate a revolutionary theory for his time, that certain diseases and conditions could be transmitted from generation to generation through the blood, and that these worsened when the progenitors shared close ancestors. This theory, which anticipated by centuries the discoveries of modern genetics, was considered too radical and potentially dangerous for the European royal houses that continued to practice marriages between relatives to a greater or lesser degree. Quevedo's work was suppressed, and he himself was urged to abandon this line of research if he wanted to continue his medical career. However, privately, some physicians and scientists throughout Europe began to pay attention to these ideas, initiating a gradual change in the understanding of inheritance and hereditary diseases that would eventually lead to reconsidering the matrimonial practices of the aristocracy. The new century began with the news that all of Europe had been awaiting and fearing at the same time. Charles Seguí, the last Spanish Habsburg, had died on November 1, 1700, at the age of 39, without leaving descendants. His will, which designated as heir Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, immediately unleashed the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that would pit the main European powers against each other for more than a decade. In Spain, as armies mobilized and alliances formed and broke, the court still echoed with the echoes of the strange story of Maria Antonia, the princess who cried teeth, and its connection to the end of the Habsburg dynasty. Dr. Francisco de Quevedo y Luna, now a respected figure in Spanish medicine despite his controversial theories, was invited to participate in Charles II's autopsy. What he found confirmed his suspicions. The last Habsburg king had suffered multiple conditions related to consanguinity, including bone deformities, endocrine problems, and, significantly, small aberrant calcifications similar to those that had ended Maria Antonia's life, though much less severe. "The same blood, the same evils," he wrote in his report. "Nature has finally put an end to what dynastic policy tried to preserve at all costs." Meanwhile, in Vienna, the Austrian branch of the Habsburgs had taken note of the lessons learned from the extinction of their Spanish relatives. Emperor Joseph I, son of Leopold I and nephew of Maria Antonia, had implemented significant changes in the family's matrimonial policy, seeking consorts who would bring new blood to the lineage. This new strategy, combined with a better medical understanding of the risks of consanguinity, would allow the Austrian branch of the Habsburgs to survive and prosper for centuries more, although they would never recover the Spanish throne. In Madrid, with the arrival of the Bourbons to the Spanish throne, the story of Maria Antonia and the curse of the blue blood passed from being a topic of current politics to becoming a historical legend, a poetic symbol of how excess pride and obsession with purity can lead to self-destruction. The new dynasty, aware of the propagandistic value of this narrative, did nothing to disprove it. On the contrary, Bourbon chroniclers emphasized the darkest aspects of the Austrians' reign, presenting Philip V as the vigorous monarch who had saved Spain from the degeneration of the Habsburgs. However, for those who knew the true story, like Dr. Quevedo, the lesson was much deeper than simple dynastic propaganda. It was a warning about the dangers of ignoring the laws of nature in the name of political ambition. In 1720, 20 years after Charles II's death and 30 after Maria Antonia's, Quevedo published a medical treatise titled De Morbis Hereditaris, on hereditary diseases, in which, without explicitly mentioning the royal family, he expounded his theories on the transmission of certain conditions through the blood and the risks of consanguineous marriages. The book, written in Latin for an academic audience, included detailed observations on cases of aberrant calcification in aristocratic families with histories of inbreeding. Although cautious in his conclusions, Quevedo's treatise represented an important advance in the scientific understanding of biological inheritance. In the Escorial, where Maria Antonia's remains continued to cry teeth according to popular legend, Prior Mendoza's small silver chest had become an object of interest for physicians and scientists throughout Europe. Quevedo, now elderly but still active in research, continued to study these strange remains, seeking clues about the exact nature of the condition that had afflicted the princess. His investigations led him to a surprising conclusion. Maria Antonia's demented calcification seemed related to a disorder of the endocrine system, specifically the pituitary gland, another condition that had been frequently observed in members of the Habsburg family. Nature speaks to us through these small misplaced teeth, he wrote in his final notes. It tells us that there is a natural order that must be respected, even by those who consider themselves above the laws of men. In 1760, 60 years after Charles II's death and 70 after Maria Antonia's, Spain was a very different country under Bourbon rule. The enlightened reforms had begun to modernize the nation, and science was starting to displace superstition in explanations of natural phenomena. However, the story of the princess who cried teeth remained alive in the collective memory, passed down from generation to generation as a warning about the dangers of isolation and inbreeding. For common people, it was a tale of horror and ghosts. For the educated, a lesson on the consequences of ignoring the laws of nature. In Vienna, the Austrian branch of the Habsburgs, which had learned the lesson from their Spanish relatives, continued to reign with a more open matrimonial policy. Although marriages continued to be arranged for dynastic reasons, links between two close relatives were avoided, which allowed the family to maintain its vitality and continue governing the Austrian Empire until the early 20th century. In the aristocratic salons throughout Europe, Maria Antonia's story had become a recurring topic of conversation when discussing marriages and alliances between great families. The curse of the blue blood was mentioned half in jest, half seriously, as a reminder that even the oldest nobility needed occasional renewal. Quevedo's scientific legacy, meanwhile, continued to influence European medicine. His observations on the inheritance of traits and diseases, initially controversial, were gradually accepted as part of standard medical knowledge. When in the 19th century Mendel's works revolutionized the understanding of genetics, many recognized in them the scientific confirmation of what Quevedo had intuited from his studies on the Habsburg family. In the Escorial monastery, the small teeth that occasionally appeared near Maria Antonia's tomb finally stopped manifesting. Perhaps because the princess's remains had finally stabilized, or perhaps because the lesson they represented had already been learned. The last entry in the diary of the prior who had succeeded Mendoza, dated 1783, mentioned this fact. It has been more than 10 years since the small teeth appeared near the sepulchre of the Austrian princess. Perhaps her spirit has finally found peace now that the lesson of her suffering has been understood. Or perhaps nature, having made its warning, no longer needs to repeat it. Indeed, the warning had been heard. The great royal families of Europe, although they continued to practice dynastic marriages, began to pay more attention to genetic diversity, seeking alliances that would bring new blood to their lineages. Maria Antonia's story, the princess who cried teeth, thus remained as a peculiar but significant chapter in the history of medicine and European politics. A reminder that, as Quevedo had written, not even kings can break the laws of nature without suffering the consequences. In the years and centuries that followed, as the science of genetics developed, physicians and historians would occasionally revisit Maria Antonia's case, analyzing it in the light of new knowledge. What was once considered a supernatural curse or divine punishment was revealed as an extreme example of the effects of prolonged inbreeding, a historical confirmation of biological principles that would only be fully understood centuries later. And thus, the princess who cried teeth, a tragic victim of the dynastic policies of her time, became an involuntary pioneering figure in the history of human understanding of genetic inheritance. Her suffering had not been in vain. It had taught future generations a vital lesson about the limits of human power in the face of the immutable laws of nature. As an anonymous 19th-century poet wrote, "Tears of bone shed the princess when the blue blood turned against itself. Her pain taught us that even the highest nobility must bow before the eternal laws of life." And thus from her suffering was born a new wisdom that forever changed the destiny of kingdoms. The curse of the blue blood that had ended the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs had transformed through time and scientific understanding into a disguised blessing, a warning that allowed other dynasties to avoid a similar fate. And somewhere beyond this world, perhaps Maria Antonia's spirit finally found consolation, knowing that her terrible illness had served a greater purpose: to teach humanity that not even the noblest lineage is above the fundamental laws of nature.